The Alpha King had watched warriors fail. He had watched royal healers fail. He had watched the strongest hunters in the frozen kingdom place fresh meat before his legendary beast and step away in fear. For 7 days, the enormous white creature had refused to eat. Not once, not even a single bite. Its strength was disappearing, and with every hour that passed, the whispers inside the palace became louder. The beast was dying. The Alpha King was losing control, and if the beast died, then perhaps the king would not remain king for much longer. Then on the 7th night, something happened that nobody in the palace could explain. A stable girl was sent into the beast's enclosure. She was not a noble. She was not a healer. She carried no weapon. She had no royal blood. She was simply there to clean the stables. She stepped through the gate with a wooden bucket in her hands. The beast lifted its head. Every guard reached for his weapon. The girl froze. The creature stared directly at her. Then something impossible happened. The beast stood. The same creature that had refused kings and warriors for 7 days slowly walked toward the girl. It stopped only inches away from her. It did not growl. It did not attack. It simply lowered its enormous head and waited. The entire courtyard went silent. The girl did not understand what it wanted, so she slowly sat down beside it. The beast closed its eyes, then it finally ate. One bite, then another. The guards stared in disbelief. The healers could not move, and from the palace balcony, the Alpha King watched without saying a word because he recognized something in the beast's eyes, something he had not seen since the day own life began to fall apart. The beast was not starving because it was sick. It had been waiting for someone. But why would the most feared creature in the kingdom trust a forgotten stable girl? And why did the Alpha King suddenly realize that the girl might be connected to the betrayal that was slowly destroying his throne? He had spent years believing his greatest enemy was outside his walls. He was about to discover that the person who could save his beast might also be the person who exposed everyone hiding inside his kingdom. And the moment that beast chose her was the moment the Alpha King's enemies made their greatest mistake. They thought they were watching their king lose control. They had no idea they were watching him become dangerous again. For 7 days, the Alpha King's legendary beast had not eaten a single bite. Every morning, fresh meat was carried into the royal enclosure. Every evening, the untouched food was taken away. The enormous white beast simply remained beside the cold stone wall. Its thick fur had lost some of its former shine. Its breathing had become slower. Its golden eyes no longer followed the warriors who entered. Even the strongest men in the kingdom were afraid to stand too close. They had seen this creature tear through armored wolves and bring entire hunting parties to their knees. Yet now it would not even lift its head for food. The kingdom was beginning to notice. Whispers traveled through the palace like smoke. The Alpha King was losing control. That was the rumor. Nobody dared to say it in the throne room. Nobody was foolish enough to speak those words while the king sat beneath the black iron crown. But behind closed doors, the nobles were becoming bolder. They watched the palace gates. They watched the king's soldiers. They watched the beast. They were waiting. The beast had always been more than an animal. It was the living symbol of the Alpha King's bloodline. For generations, the royal beast had appeared beside every true Alpha ruler. Its strength was believed to reflect the strength of the king himself. If the beast became weak, then the king must be weakening too. At least that was what the council wanted everyone to believe. The Alpha King stood alone outside the enclosure that 7th evening. His dark cloak moved gently in the freezing wind, rested across the stone walls. Beyond the palace towers, the kingdom disappeared beneath a pale winter sky. He looked through the iron bars. The beast did not move. The king's face remained calm, only his eyes betrayed him. For 7 days, he had watched the creature refuse everything: meat, water, herbs, even the rare food brought from the northern forests. Nothing worked. He had ordered the royal healers to examine it again. They had found no wound, no poison, no sickness, nothing that could explain why the creature was slowly allowing itself to starve. The king stepped closer. The beast finally raised its head. Their eyes met. For a moment, the king saw something familiar in those golden eyes. Not anger, not fear, loneliness. The same emptiness he had felt growing inside himself for months. He lowered his gaze. The sound of footsteps approached from behind. The royal healer stopped several steps away. "My king?" The Alpha King did not turn, still nothing. The healer hesitated. No. Silence filled the courtyard. Then the healer lowered his head. If it refuses food tonight, then it may not survive much longer. The king's hand tightened beneath his cloak. He had heard the same warning every day, but tonight it sounded different. Tonight it felt like a verdict. He looked again at the beast. The creature slowly lowered its head onto the stone floor. The king turned away. He could not let the court see what was happening inside him. He had been trained from childhood to show no weakness. An alpha king was supposed to remain unshaken when armies approached his borders. He was supposed to stand when others fell. He was supposed to carry every burden without allowing anyone to see the weight. But now his strongest companion was dying in front of him, and he had no idea why. Across the palace courtyard, several nobles watched from beneath the covered walkway. They did not approach. They did not need to. Their eyes were enough. The king saw them. They quickly looked away. That small movement told him more than any report could have. They were no longer afraid. That realization hurt more than he expected. For years, one glance from him had been enough to silence an entire room. Now people were beginning to calculate how much longer his power would last. The Alpha King returned to the throne room later that night. The great doors closed behind him. The council waited in silence. Their faces were respectful. Their eyes were not. The king sat upon the throne. One of the older council members slowly stepped forward. The kingdom is concerned. The Alpha King looked at him, about the beast. The council member lowered his head about what its condition may mean. The words remained in the air. The king understood the hidden message. They were not worried about the beast. They were testing him. He leaned back against the throne. Then tell the kingdom to stop worrying. The council member bowed, but there was something almost satisfied in his expression. The Alpha King noticed. He noticed everything now. Yet he said nothing. That night, the palace became strangely quiet. The king remained awake long after midnight. Beyond his chamber, the winter wind moved through the towers. Then came a distant sound, a low growl. The king opened his eyes. It came from the beast's enclosure. He rose immediately, but before he could leave his chamber, another sound echoed through the palace. A servant was calling for help. The beast had refused its food again. The king walked into the freezing courtyard. He expected to see the same scene, the same empty bowl, the same dying creature. Instead, he saw something that made him stop. A young woman stood outside the enclosure. She was holding a wooden bucket. Her clothes were old and plain. Snow covered the edge of her dark hair. She was not a healer. She was not a warrior. She was not noble. She was one of the stable girls, the kind of person most nobles never noticed. The guard beside her looked embarrassed. She had been ordered to clean the enclosure before morning. The Alpha King watched silently. The girl slowly stepped through the gate. The beast lifted its head. The entire courtyard seemed to freeze. The girl stopped. The beast stared at her. Then something happened that had not happened once in 7 days. The starving creature stood. The Alpha King's eyes narrowed. The beast took one slow step toward the girl, then another. The girl did not run. She did not scream. She simply stood there with the bucket hanging from her hand. The beast reached her. It lowered its massive head, and for the first time since it stopped eating, the creature looked alive again. The Alpha King felt something shift inside him. He did not know what the beast had recognized, but he knew one thing. The girl was not ordinary, and whatever connection existed between her and the beast was about to change everything. The courtyard had gone completely silent. No warrior moved. No servant breathed loudly. Even the guard standing beside the iron gate seemed afraid to make a sound. The enormous white beast stood only a few steps away from the stable girl. Its head was lowered. Its golden eyes remained fixed on her face. The girl held the wooden bucket against her side. Her fingers were cold and red from the winter air. A few strands of dark hair had fallen across her cheek. She looked nothing like the people who usually entered that enclosure. She carried no royal mark. She wore no expensive fabric. There was no weapon at her waist. She was simply a worker, a girl who had spent most of her life cleaning stalls and carrying water. Yet the most feared creature in the kingdom was standing quietly in front of her. The Alpha King watched from the edge of the courtyard. He had seen the beast reject warriors. He had seen it bare its teeth at healers. He had watched it turn away from food placed by royal hands. But now it was looking at a stable girl, as if it had been waiting for her. The girl slowly lowered the bucket. She did not understand why everyone was staring at her. She glanced toward the guards, then toward the king. Her eyes widened when she realized who stood behind them. She immediately lowered her head. The Alpha King said nothing. He simply watched. The beast moved closer. The girl stiffened. For one brief moment, fear crossed her face. The creature was enormous. Its shoulders rose almost to her chest. Its claws pressed into the frozen ground. Every movement carried the quiet strength of something that could destroy her in seconds. But the beast did not attack. Instead, it lowered its head until its nose was near her hand. The The girl slowly raised her fingers. The courtyard seemed to hold its breath. Her hand touched the white fur. Nothing happened, no growl, no sudden movement. The beast simply closed its eyes. The Alpha King's expression changed very slightly, but enough for the guard beside him to notice. For 7 days, the creature had refused every human touch. It was allowing a stable girl to touch it. The girl gently moved her hand through its fur. She could feel the cold beneath the thick coat. The beast leaned into her palm. Something about the sight unsettled the Alpha King. Not because he feared the girl, because he feared what the moment meant. The beast had always been able to sense things before humans could. It had reacted to enemies hidden behind walls. It had sensed danger before warriors saw it. It had known when the king was injured even from across the kingdom. If it trusted this girl, then there had to be a reason. The king stepped closer. The beast immediately opened its eyes. For one heartbeat, the girl looked between them. The beast slowly turned its head toward the king. Then it looked back at her. The king understood something strange. The creature was not simply accepting her, it was choosing her. The girl stepped toward the untouched bowl of food. She looked at it. Then she looked at the beast. The meat had been placed there hours earlier. It was still untouched. She crouched beside the bowl. Twatch watched her. She picked up a small piece. She did not force it toward the animal. She simply held it near the ground. The beast stared at the food. Nothing happened. The girl waited. The guards exchanged uncertain looks. The king remained silent. Seconds passed, then the beast moved. It lowered its head, its nose touched the meat. The girl slowly pulled her hand back. The beast took the first bite. The sound was small, almost nothing, yet the effect on the courtyard was enormous. The guards looked at each other. The healer, standing nearby, stared in disbelief. The Alpha King did not move. The beast took another bite, then another. For 7 days it had refused to eat. Now it was eating from the hand of a stable girl. The king felt the weight of every unanswered question pressing against him. Who was she? Why did the beast recognize her? And why had this happened now? The girl placed the remaining food back into the bowl. The beast continued eating. She stood slowly. The Alpha King finally approached. Every person in the courtyard lowered their head. The girl did the same. She expected punishment. Perhaps she believed she had crossed a boundary. Perhaps she believed she had touched something that belonged only to the king. But the Alpha King did not punish her. He looked at the beast, then at the girl. How did you know? Her eyes lifted slightly. She seemed confused by the question. She shook her head. She did not know. That answer disturbed him even more. Because there was no training behind her actions, no royal instruction, no hidden knowledge. She had simply sat beside a starving creature, and somehow the beast had trusted her. The Alpha King looked toward the healers. They had spent 7 days trying to understand the animal. A stable girl had understood it in minutes. The thought carried a bitter edge. Perhaps the kingdom had become so obsessed with power that it had forgotten how to recognize suffering. The girl returned to her work. She picked up the bucket. She began cleaning the enclosure as if nothing extraordinary had happened. The Alpha King watched her move through the snow. She did not ask for a reward. She did not look back. She did not try to impress him. She simply continued working. That was what made her dangerous. Not because she possessed a weapon. Not because she demanded influence. Because she appeared to want nothing. The Alpha King had spent years surrounded by people who wanted something from him. Land, gold, protection, power, titles. Every smile had carried a hidden price. Every act of loyalty had seemed to come with a calculation. But this girl had walked into the enclosure without knowing what the beast wanted, and the beast had trusted her. The king remained in the courtyard long after the others had left. He watched the girl disappear through the stable doors. Then he looked at the beast. For the first time in 7 days it was eating normally. The king should have felt relieved. Instead, he felt watched. Not by the girl, by the people who had been waiting for him to fail. Because if the beast was recovering, then the whispers about his weakness would begin to disappear. And someone inside the palace would not allow that to happen. Later that night, the Alpha King returned to the throne room. The council was already waiting. Their faces were calm, too calm. The king looked across the chamber. He saw the same noble who had watched him from the courtyard earlier that evening. The man lowered his eyes. The Alpha King noticed. He said nothing, but something had changed inside him. For the first time in months, he was no longer wondering whether his kingdom was turning against him. He was beginning to wonder who had started it, and somewhere beyond the throne room walls, the white beast was eating again. But the king knew the truth. The beast had not merely recovered. It had given him a warning. And the warning had come through the one person in the palace nobody considered important. By sunrise, the palace already knew. The beast had eaten. That single fact moved through the frozen kingdom faster than any royal messenger. Servants carried the news from the kitchens to the outer halls. Guards repeated it at the gates. Noble families heard it before breakfast. By midday, the rumor had become something larger than the truth. The Alpha King was recovering. That was what people said. But the king knew better. He stood alone before the tall windows of his private chamber and watched snow fall across the palace courtyard. Below him, the kingdom looked peaceful. Smoke rose from distant chimneys. Horses moved between the stables. Guards changed positions along the walls. Everything appeared normal. Yet the king could feel something beneath that calm. Something had shifted. His beast had eaten because of a stable girl. That fact should have brought relief. Instead, it had opened a door. The king turned away from the window and walked toward the table where several sealed reports waited. They had arrived during the night: grain shipments, military supplies, border patrols, palace expenses. Every report the seal of the royal council. He opened the first one. The numbers looked correct. He opened the second. Again, everything appeared correct. Then he placed the reports beside each other. A small difference caught his attention. The grain sent toward the northern villages had been reduced for 3 months. Yet the official record showed full deliveries. The king stared at the figures. He opened another report. The same pattern appeared. Then another. Again. The same names appeared, beside different transactions. His eyes became colder. For years he had trusted the council to handle matters that seemed beneath the attention of the crown. He had believed that ruling a kingdom meant knowing when to command and when to delegate. Now he wondered whether delegation had become blindness. A knock sounded at the door. The king closed the reports. A guard entered carrying a message. The stable girl had been ordered to remain with the beast. The king looked at him. By whose order? The guard hesitated. The council. The king's expression did not change. He dismissed the guard. Once the door closed, he looked again at the reports. The council had never shown much interest in the beast before. Now they suddenly wanted the stable girl near it. That was not coincidence. The king left his chamber. He did not take his usual route toward the throne room. Instead, he walked through the lower halls of the palace. These were places he rarely visited. The ceilings were lower. The stone walls were darker. Servants moved quickly through narrow corridors, carrying baskets and water. When they saw the king, they stopped. Some bowed, some looked frightened, others lowered their eyes and waited for him to pass. The king kept walking. He noticed something he had never noticed before. The servants did not speak when nobles passed. They became silent, but when the king passed, they became completely still. There was a difference. It was small, but it mattered. He reached the service courtyard. A group of workers stood near the supply room. One young servant carried an empty sack. Another was counting wooden crates. The king watched from the shadows. A palace steward entered. The workers immediately lowered their heads. The steward pointed toward the crates. One worker shook his head. The steward became angry. He accused them of losing supplies. The king watched carefully. The workers looked confused. Then the steward walked away carrying a sealed document. The king followed him with his eyes. A few moments later, the workers began speaking quietly. They were not complaining about the king. They were talking about missing food, the same food that official reports claimed had already been delivered. The king felt something inside him tighten. The beast had not been sick, not entirely. It had been responding to something. The kingdom was sick, and the sickness had been hidden behind paperwork and polite faces. He returned toward the stables. The snow had become heavier. The stable girl was inside the enclosure. She was sitting on the frozen ground near the beast. The animal rested beside her. Its bowl was empty. She had already cleaned it. The king stopped outside the gate. The girl noticed him. She stood immediately. The beast opened its eyes. The king watched the animal. Then he watched her. She seemed nervous, not because she wanted to impress him, because she feared making a mistake. The king entered the enclosure. The beast remained calm. That alone told him something. He looked toward the girl. "Did you notice anything strange?" She hesitated. Then she pointed toward the beast. She explained that the creature had become restless whenever certain people entered the enclosure. The king's attention sharpened. She described them carefully. A healer, a guard, a palace servant, and one council official. The same official who had stood in the courtyard the night before. The king said nothing. The girl lowered her hand. She seemed unsure whether she had said much. The king walked toward the beast. The creature remained still. Then the official's name came back into his mind. The king had seen that man near the enclosure several times during the past month. He had never considered it important. Now every memory seemed different. The king looked at the stable girl again. She had no idea what she had just revealed. She had given him something his council had failed to give him for months, a pattern. The king left the enclosure without another word. He walked directly toward the archive chamber. The palace archivist was already there. Old records covered the walls. The king ordered him to bring every document concerning the royal beast from the last year. The archivist obeyed. Dust rose as old ledgers were pulled from shelves. The king searched through them for hours. He found records of food deliveries, medical examinations, security changes, movement orders. Everything seemed ordinary. Then he found one document. A feeding schedule had been altered 3 days before the beast stopped eating. The change had been authorized by the council. The king stared at the signature. It belonged to the same official the beast had reacted against. His fingers tightened around the parchment. For the first time he understood the real danger. Someone had not simply been waiting for the beast to die. Someone had been preparing the kingdom to believe that its death was proof of his weakness. The king slowly folded the document. Outside the archive, the palace bells began to ring. The council was calling for an emergency gathering. The king looked toward the doors. A faint smile almost appeared on his face. They were moving too quickly. They still believed he was reacting. They did not understand that he had stopped reacting. He was beginning to observe. And once an alpha king stopped fighting shadows and started hunting the people who created them, there was very little chance for those people to remain hidden. The emergency bell stopped ringing just as the alpha king entered the council chamber. Every face turned toward him. The men who had been speaking in low voices immediately became silent. Several nobles stood from their seats. Their movements were careful, their expressions were respectful. Yet the king could see the tension beneath their calm faces. They had expected him to arrive angry. They had expected questions. They had expected him to demand an explanation for the beast and the stable girl. Instead, he walked to his throne without saying a word. He sat slowly. The council waited. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then the oldest council member stepped forward and bowed. "The beast has recovered." The Alpha King looked at him. "Yes." The man smiled faintly. "It appears the stable girl has an unusual connection with it." The king said nothing. The council member continued. "Perhaps she should remain responsible for the animal." That was the first mistake. The Alpha King had already discovered that the council had altered the beast's feeding schedule. Now they were trying to place the girl under their control. He leaned back against the throne. "Why?" The council member paused. "Because she seems to calm it." The king studied his face. There was no fear there, only calculation. The king dismissed the council. One by one, the nobles left the chamber. The same official remained behind for a moment. His eyes met the king's. Then he bowed and walked away. The doors closed. The Alpha King remained seated. His fingers rested against the arm of the throne. He had spent years believing that power meant seeing everything from above. Now he understood the opposite. A ruler who stayed too high could never see what happened beneath him. So, the next morning he went below. He entered the markets without his royal cloak. He walked through the northern quarter, where the poorest families lived. The streets were narrow, snow-covered broken steps. Children stood beside empty fire pits. The king saw women waiting outside a grain store. The line was too long, the supply was too small. He watched a worker distribute sacks. One family received none. The worker looked ashamed. The king moved closer. He noticed the royal seal stamped on the sacks. They had come from the palace, yet the villagers were being told that the kingdom had no grain to spare. The king looked toward the road. A wagon passed at the end of the street. It carried several large sacks. The same royal seal was visible on everyone. The wagon did not stop at the village. It continued toward the private estate of a noble family. The king followed it with his eyes. His suspicion became certainty. The missing supplies were not disappearing. They were being redirected. He returned to the palace before sunset. He did not confront anyone. Instead, he changed 3 orders. The first sent royal guards to inspect every northern supply route. The second required every grain wagon to be recorded at the palace gates. The third placed the stable workers under direct royal protection. The council noticed the changes immediately. That night, one of the council members demanded an explanation. The king gave none. He simply continued reading reports. The silence disturbed them more than anger would have, because anger could be measured. Silence could not. The stable girl remained near the beast. She had begun to understand that the palace was watching her. Servants whispered when she passed. Nobles stared at her from balconies. Some looked curious, others looked hostile. She kept her head down and continued working. But something inside the palace had changed. The beast was no longer hidden away from public attention. People came to see it. They wanted proof that the Alpha King was recovering. The beast ignored them all. It remained calm only when the stable girl was nearby. The king observed this from a distance. He began to understand that her value was not political. It was emotional. She represented something his entire court had forgotten: honesty without ambition. The realization unsettled him. He had spent years surrounded by people who wanted to be close to the crown. She was the only person who seemed happier when the crown was far away. That difference mattered. One evening, the king found her sitting outside the enclosure. The beast slept nearby. Snow fell quietly around them. The girl noticed him approaching and stood. He raised one hand. She stopped. The king looked at the beast, then he looked at her. Does it always become restless around them? The girl nodded. She pointed toward the palace. The king followed her gesture. She was pointing toward the upper tower, the council chamber. His eyes narrowed. She had noticed something he had not. Whenever the council gathered late at night, the beast became restless. Whenever certain officials entered the palace, the animal refused to sleep. The king looked back toward the enclosure. The pieces were beginning to connect. He returned to his chamber and opened the old records again. This time he searched for nights when the beast had shown unusual behavior. The pattern was clear. Every disturbance matched a council meeting. Every refusal of food followed a visit from the same official. Every change in the beast's behavior came after an alteration in the palace schedule. The king placed the records across the table. He stood over them in silence. Then he saw one final detail. The official who had changed the feeding schedule had also ordered a guard rotation around the beast's enclosure. The same guard had been present every night. The king summoned the captain responsible for palace security. The captain entered trembling. The king asked who had approved the rotation. The captain hesitated. Then he gave the name, the same council official. The king dismissed him. He stood alone again. Outside the window, the moon hung above the frozen palace. For the first time, the king did not feel powerless. He felt awake. The beast had given him the first warning. The stable girl had revealed the second. The missing grain had revealed the third. Now he knew that the conspiracy was not centered around the throne. It was woven through the entire kingdom, and the people behind it were becoming nervous. That was why the council had called the emergency meeting. That was why they wanted the girl under their control. They had realized something the king had only just discovered. She was dangerous to them, not because she carried power, because the beast trusted her, and through her, the king was beginning to see what everyone else had worked so hard to hide. The next morning, the council announced that the stable girl would be removed from the royal enclosure. The order spread through the palace before sunrise. The king received the news while standing beside the beast. The animal suddenly opened its eyes, its ears lifted, its gaze moved toward the palace. Then it released a low, warning growl. The Alpha King looked in the same direction. His expression became completely still. They had made their move, now he would make his. The order to remove the stable girl reached the lower halls before the sun rose above the frozen mountains. By the time the palace gates opened, she was already being watched. 2 guards stood outside the enclosure. Another waited near the stable doors. Nobody explained why so many armed men had suddenly appeared around a place that had been forgotten for years. The girl understood enough. Something had changed. She looked toward the white beast. It was standing, its head was raised. Its golden eyes were fixed on the guards. The creature had sensed the danger before anyone moved. The Alpha King stood on the other side of the enclosure. He had received the council's order before dawn. He had read it twice. The words were polite. The reasoning sounded reasonable. The stable girl was supposedly distracting the beast from proper royal care. Her presence was described as an unnecessary risk. But the king could see the truth beneath every sentence. The council was afraid. They had watched the beast recover. They had watched the king become suspicious. Now they wanted the one connection they could not control removed. The Alpha King folded the order and placed it inside his cloak. He did not tear it. He did not reject it. He simply walked away. That frightened the council more than anger would have. They expected resistance. They received silence. By midday, the king had changed the guard rotations around the palace. Nobody understood why. 3. Soldiers were moved from the western wall to the northern road. 2 others were sent toward the grain routes. A group of trusted riders left the capital before sunset. The orders looked ordinary. They were not. The Alpha King had begun building a network that did not depend on the council. He chose soldiers who had served during the border wars. Men who had seen him fight before the crown became heavy. Men who had no family ties to the nobles controlling the court. He did not reward them with gold. He gave them responsibility. That was enough. Meanwhile, the council believed the king was becoming passive. They saw his silence. They saw his refusal to confront them. They mistook patience for surrender. That mistake gave him time. The first piece of his plan began at the northern supply road. A royal wagon was stopped before entering the capital. The guards opened the covers. Inside were sacks marked with the royal seal. The records claimed the wagon carried grain for the palace kitchens. It did not. The captain found hidden documents beneath the sacks. Names, payments, delivery routes, private estates. The evidence was enough to expose several nobles, but the king did not arrest them. Not yet. He ordered the document sealed. Then he ordered the wagon released. The captain looked confused. The king simply walked away. He knew the council had spent years hiding their network. Destroying one part would only warn the rest. He wanted the entire structure. He wanted every name, every route, every connection, every person who believed the crown was too blind to see them. That evening, the king returned to the stables. The girl was still there. She had been working since morning. Her hands were tired. Her clothes were damp from the snow. She looked toward the king when he entered. He stopped near the enclosure. The beast remained calm. The girl lowered her eyes. She seemed afraid that she had become the reason trouble was coming. The king noticed. For the first time, he understood how different her fear was from the fear of nobles. Nobles feared losing power. She feared causing harm. That distinction stayed with him. He looked at the beast, then at the girl. He did not tell her what was happening. He simply ordered that she remain in the royal stables. The council's removal order was never carried out. The guards received new instructions. The girl stayed, but the palace did not remain quiet. The next morning, the rumors became worse. Some nobles claimed the stable girl had bewitched the beast. Others said the Alpha King had become dependent on her. A few began calling the king weak behind closed doors. The word spread through the palace. The king heard them. He did nothing. Instead, he entered the training yard. For months, his enemies had believed that the king's physical strength was declining. They had seen him withdraw from public combat. They had seen him spend more time inside the palace. They assumed he was becoming soft. That morning, he picked up a sword. The soldiers stopped training. The king walked into the center of the frozen yard. He moved slowly at first, then faster. His body remembered what his mind had been forced to forget. The sword cut through the cold air again. Each movement was controlled. There was no wasted strength, no unnecessary display. The soldiers watched in silence. The king had not become weaker. He had become restrained, and restraint was more dangerous than rage. When he finished training, the courtyard remained silent. He lowered the sword. One of the older commanders stepped forward. The commander had served the royal family for decades. He looked at the king and bowed. The king gave him a sealed order. The commander read it. His expression changed. The order contained the names of 3 noble families believed to be loyal to the council. The commander understood immediately. The king was not asking him to attack them. He was asking him to watch them. That was the beginning of something larger. Across the kingdom, other pieces began moving. Old soldiers returned to their posts. Royal messengers traveled without council approval. Supply routes were monitored. Palace records were copied. The king began receiving information from places that had been silent for years. Every report gave him another piece of the truth. The council had controlled the kingdom by controlling information. So, the king began taking information away from them. Within weeks, the power beneath the throne started shifting. Nobody noticed at first. The nobles still held their estates. The council still held its seats. The palace still looked the same. But the king was no longer alone. He had begun building loyalty in silence. One evening, the stable girl carried food into the enclosure. The beast ate immediately. Then it stopped. Its head turned toward the eastern gate. The girl followed its gaze. Nothing appeared unusual. But the Alpha King had learned to trust the creature's instincts. He ordered the guards to investigate. They found a man hiding beyond the outer wall. He carried no royal insignia, but inside his coat they found a sealed message. The message contained the schedule of the king's private movements. Someone inside the palace had been sending information outside. The king read the message alone. His face became cold. The conspiracy was no longer a suspicion. It was alive. It was watching him. And now the king understood the most dangerous truth of all. The enemy was not trying to defeat the man he had been. They were trying to stop the man he was becoming. The king folded the message. Outside his chamber, the palace remained quiet, but somewhere in the darkness, someone was already realizing that the Alpha King had started moving, and once he began moving against them, the kingdom would never return to the way it had been. The first sign that the king's strategy was working came from the nobles themselves. They began turning against one another. For years, they had moved through the palace as one powerful group. They had shared information. They had protected each other's interests. They had believed that the Alpha King could be isolated because every path leading to him passed through the council. Now those paths were disappearing. A report reached the king before sunrise. One noble family had suddenly stopped sending payments to another. A second had closed its private warehouses. A third had requested armed protection from the crown. The king read every report without showing emotion. Fear had entered the palace. Not fear of the king's sword. Fear of uncertainty. The nobles no longer knew who the king trusted. They no longer knew which soldiers were loyal to the crown. They no longer knew whether their own allies were secretly working with the palace. That uncertainty became the king's strongest weapon. He did not need to threaten them. He only needed to let them wonder. By afternoon, the council called another private gathering. The Alpha King was not invited. That was exactly what he wanted. A trusted commander watched the chamber from a distant corridor. Another watched the movement of messengers. A third monitored the supply records. The king had built eyes inside the palace without placing a single spy near the council table. He was learning to control the kingdom without appearing to control anything. Meanwhile, the stable girl had become the subject of another attack. A noblewoman arrived at the stables carrying a sealed order. She claimed the girl had violated royal protocol by entering the beast's enclosure without permission. The girl looked at the document. Her face became pale. She had no understanding of palace politics. She only knew that she could lose the position that had become her entire life. The noblewoman waited for her to panic. Instead, the white beast rose behind her. Its massive body filled the doorway. The noblewoman stepped backward. The beast did not growl. It did not need to. Its eyes were enough. The noblewoman left without another word. The girl remained still. She looked at the beast, then toward the palace. She understood that someone wanted her gone, but she did not understand why. That evening, the Alpha King found her near the winter garden. She stood beside a frozen fountain. Snow had gathered on the stone edges. The king stopped several steps away. She lowered her head. He studied her expression. She looked tired, not physically, emotionally. The palace was becoming too dangerous for someone who had never asked to be part of it. The king understood that, but he also knew that sending her away would give his enemies exactly what they wanted. He ordered her to remain within the protected section of the royal grounds. She accepted. There was no gratitude in her expression, only quiet relief. The king walked away. He had expected that relief to mean nothing. Instead, it stayed in his mind. For the first time, he realized that protecting her was not simply part of his strategy. He had begun to care whether she was safe. That realization frightened him more than any threat from the council. He had spent years protecting himself from attachment. Attachment created weakness. That was what he had always believed. But now he wondered whether the real weakness had been refusing to care about anyone at all. The next morning, another report arrived. The northern commander had discovered a hidden storehouse. Inside were weapons. Not enough to start a war, enough to prepare for one. The weapons carried no royal markings. The commander sent the information directly to the king. The king ordered everything moved to a secure location. He did not seize the storehouse publicly. He wanted the people who owned it to believe it had remained hidden. That decision created another opportunity. The king began tracing the materials. The metal had come from a private forge. The forge had been paid by a merchant. The merchant had received money from a noble family. That family had direct ties to the council. The chain was becoming visible. The king followed it slowly. Every answer created another question. Every name led to another name. The conspiracy was larger than the council itself. It had become an entire network, but the network had one weakness. Everyone involved believed the Alpha King was still reacting to events. They did not know he had begun creating them. 3 days later, the king made a public decision that shocked the palace. He announced that several military commanders would be transferred away from the capital. The council celebrated quietly. They believed the king was weakening his own defenses. The truth was different. The commanders were being sent to secure the outer regions. The king was preparing the kingdom beyond the palace. The council saw fewer soldiers around the throne. They did not see the larger force gathering beyond their reach. This was the moment the king's transformation became complete. He no longer needed to be seen as powerful. He only needed to be powerful where it mattered. The beast seemed to sense the change. Its movements became stronger. Its appetite returned completely. It began walking through the enclosure with the old confidence that had once made warriors fear it. The stable girl watched it from the doorway. She placed her hand against its fur. The beast lowered its head. She smiled faintly. For a moment the palace felt far away. Then a royal messenger arrived. The smile disappeared from her face. The message was for the king. The council had requested a public hearing. They wanted the Alpha King to answer accusations that his rule was being influenced by a stable girl. The king read the message. He looked toward the courtyard. The nobles were already gathering. They believed they had finally found his weakness. The king folded the paper. Then he walked toward the throne room. He did not summon his commanders. He did not call the guards. He did not prepare a public defense. He walked alone. The doors opened. Hundreds of eyes turned toward him. The council stood together. The was read before the court. The stable girl was being blamed for the beast's strange behavior. She was being accused of manipulating the Alpha King. The king listened without interrupting. The nobles watched his face. They expected anger, expected humiliation. They expected him to defend himself. Instead, he remained completely calm. When the accusation ended, he looked across the chamber. Then he accepted the council's request for a formal investigation. The court erupted in quiet whispers. The council believed they had won, but the king had not surrendered. He had just given them permission to expose themselves, because every person who spoke against him would now have to reveal what they knew. Every lie would create a record. Every accusation would create evidence, and every hidden ally would be forced to choose a side. The king turned toward the council. His eyes stopped on the official whose name appeared in every suspicious record. The man smiled. For the first time, the king returned the expression. It was not warmth, it was recognition. The official did not understand, but the audience would. The Alpha King had finally stopped defending his throne. He was preparing to let his enemies destroy themselves, and somewhere beneath the palace floor, another secret was waiting to be uncovered. A secret that would reveal how close the betrayal had come to the king himself. The investigation began beneath the eyes of the entire court. For the first time in years, the council believed they had the Alpha King where they wanted him. The accusation against the stable girl had given them a reason to question his judgment in public. Noble families filled the great hall. Military commanders stood along the walls. Servants gathered beyond the pillars and watched through narrow spaces between the curtains. The stable girl stood alone near the center of the chamber. She looked small beneath the enormous banners of the royal house. Her hands were folded tightly in front of her. She knew that everyone was watching her. She also knew that she had done nothing wrong. But innocence meant little in a court where powerful men controlled the truth. The Alpha Kings sat above them all. His expression was unreadable. The council presented its evidence. There were reports claiming that the beast had become dependent on the girl. There were records showing that she had entered the enclosure without formal permission. There were statements from servants who claimed she had spent unusual amounts of time near the creature. Every piece of evidence seemed carefully arranged, too carefully. The king listened. He did not interrupt. He did not defend the girl. That confused everyone. The council expected him to protect her. Instead, he allowed them to continue. More accusations followed. They claimed the girl had manipulated the beast. They claimed her presence had weakened the royal authority. They suggested that the king had become emotionally attached to someone beneath his station. The final accusation was designed to humiliate him. The king remained still. The stable girl lowered her head. For a moment, the great hall seemed unbearably quiet. Then the beast appeared at the entrance. The doors opened slowly. The enormous white creature walked inside. Every conversation died instantly. The beast moved through the chamber without fear. Its eyes passed over the nobles. Then it walked toward the stable girl. The guards stepped forward. The Alpha King raised one hand. They stopped. The beast reached the girl and lowered its head beside her. The court watched in silence. The council leader looked disturbed. He had expected the creature to remain in its enclosure. He had not expected it to enter the heart of the court. The Alpha King looked at the beast. Then he looked at the council. Something had changed in his eyes. The king finally understood why the creature had refused to eat. It had not been waiting for food. It had been waiting for truth. The beast had reacted to the people surrounding the king because it sensed what he could not yet see: fear, deception, hidden hostility. The king remembered every moment from the past year. Every time the beast had growled, every time it had refused to enter a certain room, every time it had become restless during a council meeting. The pattern was no longer hidden, it was standing in front of him. The king rose from the throne. The court became silent. He walked toward the evidence table. One report lay beneath the others. He picked it up, the feeding schedule, the altered record that had started everything. He held it where the council could see. Then he placed another document beside it, the grain shipment record. Then another, the guard rotation. Then another, the hidden payment record. The faces around the chamber began changing. The council members looked at one another. The king continued placing documents across the table, each one connected to the next. Each one carried a name. Each name led back to the same circle. The stable girl watched silently. She had no idea what the documents meant, but the court understood. The accusation against her was beginning to collapse. The council leader stepped forward. He tried to explain the records. The king looked at him. The explanation stopped before it finished. The king had already found the pattern. For months, the council had controlled the flow of information. They had altered records, redirected supplies, moved guards, changed orders. They had isolated the king while making him believe the kingdom was slowly turning against him. The greatest deception had been psychological. They wanted him to doubt his own strength. They wanted him to believe the beast was dying because his bloodline was failing. They wanted him to become desperate. A desperate king was easy to control, but they had made one mistake. They had brought the stable girl into the beast's enclosure, and the beast had responded. That single moment had awakened the king's suspicion. Now, the entire conspiracy was exposed. The council leader looked toward the nobles. Some had already stepped away from him. That was the first crack the king noticed. He understood how power truly worked. People stayed loyal to the strongest side. The moment they believed the council could fall, they would abandon it. The king did not need to order them. He only needed to let fear spread. A military commander stepped forward. He placed a sealed document before the throne. It contained evidence from the northern roads. Another commander followed, then another. Reports began arriving from different parts of the kingdom. Hidden weapons, missing grain, secret payments, unauthorized movements. The council had believed its network was invisible. Now its own victims were bringing the evidence into the throne room. The Alpha King looked toward the stable girl. She was still standing beside the beast. For months he had believed that protecting the kingdom required becoming harder. Now he understood something deeper. He had not been weak because he cared. He had been weak because he had allowed others to decide whom he could trust. That mistake was over. The king turned toward the council leader. His voice remained calm. "You wanted the truth." The man stared at him. The king placed the final document on the table. "This is the truth." The room fell silent. The council leader looked down. His confidence was disappearing, but the king knew the investigation was not finished. The evidence exposed the network. It did not yet reveal who had created it. Someone had designed the entire operation. Someone had known the king's habits. Someone had known his private movements. Someone had known how to manipulate the beast's environment. Someone had known exactly how isolated the Alpha King had become. The king looked toward the dark balcony above the court. A thought entered his mind. The betrayal had not begun in the council chamber. It had begun much closer to him, perhaps much closer than anyone imagined. The beast suddenly lifted its head, its golden eyes fixed on the upper balcony. A low growl rolled through the hall. Every person turned. The Alpha King followed the creature's gaze. There was nobody standing there, only darkness. But the king no longer believed in empty shadows. Someone had been watching him for a long time, and now the king was finally ready to watch back. The upper balcony remained empty, yet the Alpha King did not look away. The white beast continued staring into the darkness. Its body had become completely still. Even its breathing seemed quieter. The entire court waited for something to happen. Nothing did. Then the king noticed a small movement near the far wall. A curtain shifted, only slightly. Most people would have missed it. The king did not. He raised his hand. The guards moved toward the balcony. The court erupted into nervous whispers. Within moments they returned with a man. He was not a noble. He was not a soldier. He was an old palace attendant who had served inside the royal residence for many years. The king recognized him. That recognition carried a deeper shock than the man's capture. He had seen that face countless times. The attendant had entered his chambers. He had carried private messages. He had served meals during council nights. He had been close enough to hear conversations that no ordinary servant should ever hear. The king stared at him. The attendant lowered his head. His hands were shaking. The king did not ask who sent him. He already knew the answer would not be simple. The guards searched the man's clothing. They found a small sealed packet. Inside was a list: names, times, locations, private movements. Everything the king had done during the previous month was recorded. The court became silent again. The king read the first page. His expression hardened. The list included meetings he had never announced. It included his visits to the stables. It included the nights he had entered the archive chamber. It even included the movements of the stable girl. Someone had been watching both of them. The king looked at the attendant. The man finally raised his eyes. Fear filled them. Not fear of punishment, fear of the person who had ordered him. The king understood. The attendant was only a piece. The real enemy remained hidden. He ordered the guards to take the man away. Then he turned toward the council. The council leader had stopped pretending to be confident. Several members were already looking toward the exits. The king saw their fear. He saw the moment they realized the game had changed. They had wanted a weak king. They had created a patient one. The Alpha King descended from the throne. He walked through the chamber slowly. Nobody spoke. The beast followed behind him. The sound of its paws against the stone floor echoed through the hall. The king stopped before the council leader. The man looked smaller now, not because his body had changed, because the power around him had disappeared. The king looked at him for several seconds, then he turned away. He did not need to punish him yet. The man's greatest punishment had already begun. Everyone who once depended on him was now watching him fall. The king walked toward the stable girl. She stood beside the beast. Her eyes were filled with uncertainty. The king looked at her hands. They were still rough from years of work. The same hands that had cleaned stalls had uncovered a weakness inside the palace that powerful men had hidden for years. He finally understood why the beast had chosen her. She did not see rank. She saw suffering. She had approached the beast when everyone else approached it with fear. That simple difference had changed the kingdom. The king extended his hand. The girl looked at it. For a moment she hesitated, then she placed her hand in his. The court watched. It was not a grand gesture. It was something quieter, more important. Trust. The king helped her step forward. Then he turned toward the throne. The old power structure was collapsing behind him. He could feel it. For years the throne had been surrounded by people who wanted access to power. Now those people were losing their grip. The king returned to his seat. The beast remained beside him. The stable girl stood nearby. The court waited for judgment. The king ordered the council records opened. Every hidden transaction was examined. Every altered order was reviewed. Every secret payment was traced. One by one, the names connected to the conspiracy were removed from positions of authority. Some nobles surrendered immediately. Others tried to deny everything. But denial could not survive against records gathered from every corner of the kingdom. The king had prepared for this moment long before the court understood what was happening. His commanders entered with sealed reports. His messengers returned from the northern roads. His guards brought evidence from the private estates. The kingdom itself seemed to speak through them. The council had spent years controlling information. Now information had become the weapon that destroyed them. By nightfall, the old council no longer existed. The king stood alone in the throne room. The great hall was almost empty. Snow fell beyond the tall windows. The firelight moved across the stone floor. The stable girl remained near the doorway. The beast rested beside her. The king looked toward them. Something inside him felt different. He had once believed power meant never allowing anyone close enough to hurt him. Now he understood the flaw in that belief. Distance had not protected him. It had isolated him. That isolation had allowed his enemies to control what he saw. The stable girl had broken that isolation without even trying. She had not made him weaker. She had reminded him what strength was supposed to protect. The king rose. He walked toward the window. Below the palace, the kingdom was quiet, but beyond those walls, the news of the council's collapse was already spreading. The old rulers were gone. The throne was no longer divided by hidden hands. Yet, the king knew this was not the end. It was the beginning because the council had been only the inner circle. The deeper network still existed. There were nobles outside the capital who had not yet been exposed. There were merchants who had financed the conspiracy. There There were soldiers who had accepted hidden orders, and somewhere beyond the frozen borders, there were enemies who had been waiting for the kingdom to become weak. The Alpha King looked toward the dark mountains. His eyes were calm. The fear that once followed him had returned, but this time it was different. It was not the fear of a ruler losing control. It was the fear of a ruler who had finally taken control back. Behind him, the beast slowly rose. The stable girl turned toward it. The creature walked to the king's side. For 7 days it had refused to eat. Now it stood stronger than ever. The king placed one hand against its white fur. Then he looked toward the throne. He had reclaimed it, but reclaiming the throne was no longer enough. He had learned how easily a kingdom could be poisoned from within, so he would build something that could not be controlled the same way again. The old council had ruled through fear. The new Alpha King would rule through loyalty. The old kingdom had depended on appearances. His kingdom would depend on truth, and as the first light of morning touched the frozen mountains, the king made his final decision. He would not simply restore what had been broken. He would build something stronger, something larger, something his enemies would never be able to manipulate again. The Alpha King had survived the betrayal. Now the kingdom was about to discover what he would become after it. The morning after the council fell felt different. The palace was still standing. The banners still moved beneath the frozen wind. The guards still walked along the walls. The throne still waited beneath the ancient crest. Yet the kingdom had changed. For the first time in years, there was no hidden council deciding which truth should reach the Alpha King. No secret group controlled the royal records. No noble faction could quietly redirect his orders while pretending to serve him. The king stood before the tallest window of the palace and watched the sunrise spread across the frozen valley. The light touched the snow one mountain at a time. He remained silent. Behind him, the white beast stood near the doorway. The creature looked stronger than it had looked in years. Its coat shone beneath the pale morning light. Its breathing was steady. Its eyes were clear. The same beast that had once refused every meal now looked like the living symbol of a kingdom returning to strength. The stable girl entered the chamber carrying a simple tray. She stopped when she saw the king. For a moment, neither moved. She had never imagined standing inside the private chamber of the Alpha King. She had entered his world by accident. She had cleaned his stables. She had sat beside a starving beast. She had never asked for power. Yet somehow her quiet presence had become part of the moment that changed everything. The king looked at her. Then he looked at the beast. The creature walked toward her. It lowered its massive head. She placed her hand against its fur. The king watched the scene without jealousy or suspicion. He understood what the beast had taught him. Trust did not need to be forced. The strongest bond in his kingdom had not been created through fear. It had been created through patience. That lesson would shape the reign that followed. By midday, the king entered the great hall. Hundreds of people waited. Some were nobles. Some were soldiers, some were workers who had never before been allowed to stand so close to the throne. The old system would have separated them. The new king did not. He stood before them without the heavy ceremonial armor that previous rulers had used to display authority. He wore simple royal clothing. His presence was enough. The room became silent. The king looked across the gathered people. He saw fear in some faces, hope in others, suspicion in a few. He did not blame them. They had lived under a system that taught them to fear the palace. Changing that fear would take time. He began rebuilding the kingdom from the inside. The first changes came to the supply routes. Every royal shipment would now be recorded openly. Every major storehouse would answer directly to the crown. No private noble family would control food meant for the people. The second change affected the military. Commanders would be chosen for loyalty and ability rather than family name. The third change reached the palace workers. Their complaints would no longer disappear inside hidden offices. Their voices would reach the throne. These were not dramatic changes. They were stronger than drama. They changed the foundation. Within weeks, the kingdom began to feel the difference. Grain reached villages that had been ignored. Broken roads were repaired. Military posts received proper supplies. Workers were treated with greater respect. The nobles noticed the shift. Some accepted it. Others hated it, but none could stop it. The Alpha King had learned that a ruler did not need everyone to love him. He needed the kingdom to function without hidden hands controlling it. His enemies had once believed that his kindness made him vulnerable. They had been wrong. His kindness now had structure, his mercy had limits, his loyalty had conditions, and his judgment had become harder than stone. The stable girl remained near the royal beast. Her position changed slowly. She was no longer treated as an ordinary worker. But she never asked for a title. She continued visiting the beast each morning. She continued helping the stable workers. She continued living without the hunger for influence that had poisoned so many people around the throne. The king noticed, every day he noticed, their connection did not become something sudden. It became something deeper. Trust grew through small moments, a quiet glance, a shared understanding, a presence that required no explanation. The king had spent years believing that love and loyalty could become chains. Now he understood that the right person could become the reason a ruler refused to become cruel. The beast seemed to understand it too. Whenever the king entered the stable, the creature remained calm. Whenever the stable girl sat beside it, the beast relaxed completely. The three of them became an unusual symbol inside the palace. The king represented authority, the beast represented strength, the stable girl represented trust. Together, they became something the old council had never understood. A kingdom could be powerful without being ruled entirely through fear. But peace did not last. One evening, a messenger arrived from the northern border. He had ridden for 2 days without stopping. His horse was exhausted. His clothes were covered in snow. The mess carried the seal of the northern commander. The Alpha King opened it. His eyes moved across the page. The kingdom had received word that the council had fallen. The news had reached neighboring territories. Several rulers believed the kingdom was vulnerable during the transition. Troops were gathering beyond the frozen mountains. The king folded the message. He did not panic. He had expected this. The old enemies had waited for weakness. They believed the fall of the council had created an opening. They did not understand that the king had been preparing for this moment since the first grain shipment was discovered. He walked to the war room. Maps covered the walls. His commanders were already waiting. The king studied the northern border. Then he looked at the mountains. The enemy believed they were approaching a wounded kingdom. They were not. They were approaching a kingdom that had finally stopped fighting itself. The Alpha King placed his hand on the map. His commanders waited for the order. The king remained silent for several seconds. Then the white beast entered the war room. Every commander turned. The creature walked directly toward the king. It stopped beside him. The king looked at the beast, then toward the northern mountains. A faint expression appeared on his face. Not a smile, something colder, certainty. The enemies beyond the border had made the same mistake as the council. They had mistaken transformation for weakness. They were about to learn the truth. The Alpha King had not rebuilt his kingdom merely to protect his throne. He had rebuilt it so no one would ever again mistake his silence for surrender. And beyond the frozen mountains, an army was already moving toward him. They believed they were coming to conquer a weakened king. They had no idea they were walking directly toward the beginning of his empire. The first enemy banners appeared beyond the frozen mountains before dawn. They moved slowly through the white valley like a dark river, crossing the snow. Thousands of soldiers followed them. Their armor caught the pale light. Their weapons rose above the marching lines. They had come expecting a kingdom divided by fear. They had come expecting a king weakened by betrayal. They had come believing the fall of the old council had left the throne exposed. They were wrong. The Alpha King stood on the highest wall of the capital and watched them approach. The wind pulled at his cloak. Snow moved across the stone beneath his boots. Behind him stood the commanders who had once doubted whether the kingdom could survive the collapse of the council. Now they stood without fear. Their soldiers filled the walls. Every tower was occupied. Every gate was secured. Every supply route had been prepared weeks before the enemy army ever appeared. The king did not look like a ruler waiting for an attack. He looked like a ruler who had been waiting for the enemy to arrive. The white beast stood beside him. Its enormous body was still. Its golden eyes watched the distant army. The stable girl remained farther behind with the royal attendants. She looked toward the king and understood something without being told. The man who had once seemed trapped inside his own palace was gone. The silence that once came from loneliness had become the silence of control. The enemy army stopped beyond the outer valley. Their commander expected surrender. Instead, the northern gates remained closed. No messenger approached. No flag of negotiation appeared. The Alpha King simply waited. The enemy commander had studied the kingdom before the attack. He believed the king would react emotionally. He believed the memory of betrayal had made him desperate to prove his strength. That was another mistake. The king had learned patience. He had learned that the strongest move was sometimes the one that forced the enemy to reveal his intentions first. The enemy army waited through the morning, then through the afternoon. Nothing happened. The soldiers became restless. Their commanders began arguing. The kingdom remained silent. By sunset, the enemy had suffered the first problem. Their supply wagons were not arriving. The routes behind them had been blocked. The roads they planned to use were under royal control. The villages they expected to support them had already been protected by the king. The enemy had marched into a kingdom that had prepared itself from the inside out. The Alpha King had not needed to defeat them on the battlefield. He had already defeated the weakness that made invasion possible. The next morning, the enemy commander finally sent a messenger. The messenger entered the capital under a white flag. He expected to see fear. Instead, he found the great hall filled with soldiers. The Alpha King sat on the throne. The white beast rested beside him. The stable girl stood near the entrance. The messenger looked around the hall.